Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a decidedly different take on the Rabe Creations podcast. My name's Nicole, and I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, here in Canada, where I live with my husband, Barry, and my beautiful, wonderful rescued Rottweiler named Grace. Welcome to my kitchen. So, I have been experimenting with natural dyeing. I talked about it a little bit on my last podcast. And if you follow me on Instagram, you may have already seen some of the skeins of yarn that I have managed to dye up. So I thought that this morning I would take you along with me throughout my day and show you the technique that I use to do my natural dyeing. So to start out, I will be taking 2 skeins of yarn. It is a 75-25 superwash merino and nylon blend, and it's a DK weight. It is a bare yarn. It is superwash, which means I don't need to scour the yarn. I'll get more into the technicalities of things as we go. So this is the yarn that I plan to dye. And I will be using today, I'm doing 2 different dye pots today. I do dye in extremely small batches. I dye single skeins at a time, which makes them very, very unique and very one-offs. The neat thing about natural dyeing is that because the tones are much more subtle, I find that they all work well together, which is kind of nice. You can do gradients and whatnot using naturally dyed yarn, and generally it always works out. So what am I going to dye with today? Well, I have been collecting lowly dandelions. Yes, I am sure my neighbors think I am insane. Every time I take Miss Gracie out for a walk, I go with a little plastic bag and we pick dandelions along the way. So I'm sure the neighbors think I'm that crazy lady who picks all the neighborhood dandelions. But yes, so dandelions will be one dye pot. And in the other dye pot, I am doing petunias. Now I have dyed with either of these, oh my goodness, the words. I have not dyed with either of these plant materials before. So this is truly an experiment that I'm taking you along with me for. All right, so I'm just going to change up some camera angles and I will take you through step by step the entire process. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is get the skeins ready for the mordant pot. So what a mordant is, it's a soak that you do with the yarn, with the wool, before you apply dye, and it helps to allow the dye to actually set. So it's important that you mordant your yarn. It helps to get a little bit more color fastness. Now, you're never going to get the same amount of color fastness out of natural dyes as you do from commercial acid dyes. It is just the nature of natural dyeing that it will eventually fade over time. Some colors are considered fugitive dyes, and they will fade rather quickly. Other dyes are nearly permanent, so yeah, as for the 2 dyes I'm doing today, I have no idea. Part of the adventure. So the first thing I'm going to do with my skeins is, of course, unbind them. They are tied with a figure-8 knot to help keep them from getting all tangled up in the dye pot. Although this one does not look great. This one may have some issues. That's all right. So I have these wonderful plastic zip ties. And what I'm going to be doing with those is putting 1 zip tie on each hank skein bundle o' yarn. Not tightly, just loosely. What that does is it allows me to have something that I can use to manipulate the yarn with. It makes it a little bit easier to be pulling things in and out of the mordant bath and or the dye baths. So I'll put 1 of those on each skein. Now, if these yarns were not superwash, I would have to scour them. So that means going through a process with the yarn that gets rid of any of the natural lanolins and stuff that are left on the yarn that will cause it to not take the dye as well as you would like. So, but because these are superwash, I do not need to go through that step. So it is going to be straight into the mordant bath. All right, so I have a pot of just regular tap water. As you can see, I have labeled it dye pot. Anything that you actually use for dyeing, you should never ever again use for food preparation. Now, although I'm doing all natural dyeing and not using any commercial acid dyes or anything like that, that does not mean that it's not toxic. There are definitely plants and plant matter that when you use it, can be quite toxic, and it's just a good habit to get into, that anything you use for dyeing is no longer used for food prep. A lot of people don't even like to dye in their kitchens, but I have no other space, so the kitchen it is. So just a pot that is about 3/4 of the way full with normal tap water, and into this I am going to add some alum. Alum is a chemical, however, it is food safe alum. It's used in canning and whatnot, in preserving as well, so it is food safe. And the way that I determine how much alum to put in, take out my little scale. And I need to calibrate to grams. I do, let me see here, 8 grams of alum for every 100 grams of fiber. And I'm dyeing today 200 grams of fiber. So I am going to need 16 grams of alum. So here is the alum, and it's just like a really granulated type thing. So I have calibrated this to not take the weight of the little glass container into consideration. So we're at 3, 5, 7, 10, 12, 14, 15, 16. So that is the perfect amount of alum. The spoon and everything you're seeing today is all dye-specific materials. Close that back up. And I was able to find alum in larger quantities through Amazon. So there is my 16 grams of alum. And I am just going to take that and pour it straight into the water. Now, when I am dyeing, I am very careful to be gentle with the wool. Now, I know this is superwash wool. I'm just going to be stirring this to help the alum to dissolve. I know this is superwash wool, and it does handle changes in temperature better than other non-superwash wool, but I am taking my time and being cautious with it anyway. The last thing I want is for the wool to felt up in the dye process. So I am just going to stir this until the alum starts to dissolve into the water. And to this, I am also going to be adding some cream of tartar. Again, food safe. I bought it from the grocery store in the baking aisle. And for the cream of tartar, again, all of this is specific to my dye, so I'm not too worried about using the same spoon that I just used for the alum, because it will only ever be used for this. And I put in about one of those teaspoons of cream of tartar. Now, every person, I've done a significant amount of research on this before I began, and every single person seems to have their own measurements and their own ways to do things. And so far, this has worked out well for me. So I am just showing you what I normally do. So things are looking pretty good here. So the next thing I'm going to do is gently lower my 2 skeins of yarn into the pot. Oh, you know what? It does need to be stirred a little bit more. Not quite as dissolved as I would like it to be. Now, one of the interesting things about this process is that it is an all-day process. I, of course, will not keep you plugged in all day. We will be coming back periodically to check in. And every time I do something else in the process, I will record and show you the steps involved. But the finished product actually will not be shown until probably late tomorrow afternoon. So my process does take about 2 days to get a dried, ready to go skein of yarn. So I'm going to take this and I am going to slowly put it straight into my pot. And the other one too. Now I know people are probably gasping and saying, Nicole, where are your gloves? Do as I say, not as I do. Always wear gloves. I actually have an issue with rubber gloves. They can't stand them. If I was dealing with anything other than food safe chemicals, I would most certainly be wearing gloves, and I would be washing my hands as soon as I'm finished this. So what I'm doing is I'm just tamping down the wool so that it is completely submerged in the alum bath. All right. So it is completely submerged now. And I am going to be moving my dye pot to the stove, or my alum bath pot to the stove. So in the first of many steps today, I am taking my alum bath pot and bringing it to the stove. And I'm going to be turning the burner to a, where are we here? Dual burner, to a medium, a low medium. And now the waiting game begins. So I will be mordanting my yarn in a, I will be bringing it up to temperature, up to a temperature of about 80 to 82 degrees. And then I will be holding it at that temperature for approximately an hour. And then it can just keep soaking in its pot as it cools back down to room temperature. I continuously bring my yarn from a room temperature up to temperature and then back down to room temperature every time I move yarn from one bath to the next. So it'll move from this mordant bath into a actual true dye bath. And every time I do that, I make sure that the temperature of both liquids and the yarn are approximately the same, and that is at room temperature. It adds to the time that it takes for me to dye up my skeins, but I believe it is gentler to the yarn and you risk less chance of felting occurring. Alrighty, so we're going to let that sit, and in the meantime I will start extracting my dyes, and I'll show you how I do that, because that is a little bit different. I do that a little bit differently than I have seen most people do it. So, you know, if I didn't do things different, I wouldn't be me. So yeah, I'm just going to change angles again and show you how we extract the dye. All right, friends. So here is where I have deviated a little bit from standard practices when it comes to dyeing. So I only have one stove in my house, and because I take a very low and slow approach to yarn dyeing, I was struggling to figure out how I was going to cook my yarn, for lack of a better term. And then I thought, slow cookers, crock pots, they keep temperatures at a nice steady. You can regulate your temperature in them. You can, you know, and it's small. It's plugged in on the counter somewhere. It's not on the stove top. I figured it would work out just fine. So I dye in crock pots. The silver one, the bigger one on the side, was my family's crock pot that I have now usurped because it can only be used for dyeing now, but we're never using it anymore anyway. And then this white one I went to the Goodwill store and picked up for, you know, 14 bucks, I think it was. So they are serving me quite well. Again, I do very, very small batch dyeing, so it's not a big deal, and I'm more comfortable with this than having hot plates all over the place. So, welcome to yarn dyeing in crock pots. So this is where the magic begins when it comes to extracting the colors for your dyes. So as I said, I've got 2 crock pots. I have Dandelion and Petunias that I'm attempting to dye with today. So we'll start out with the Dandelion. This is what I've collected this morning on my walk with the dog. And this is what I've collected over the past couple of weeks. So I have been keeping the dandelions in the freezer. So every day after our walk, I would just dump all of the fresh ones into the frozen ones and pop it back into the freezer. I've been told that this will not affect the quality of the dye that I pull out. So I have seen other people dye with dandelion, and the expected color is a light yellow, which makes sense. Now that doesn't always make sense. I mean, avocados give you pink. So yeah, it doesn't always, it's not always true to the color of the dye raw product that you're using, but we're going to give it a try and see what happens. So in each of the crock pots, in the larger black one, I have put in 3 liters of regular room temperature tap water. And in the smaller blue one, it's about 2.5 liters of regular temperature, or room temperature regular tap water. So I do have more raw material for the dandelion pot, so I am going to use the bigger pot for the dandelions. So into the plain water, I just dump in all the dandelions. And I have to tell you, the frozen dandelions are already starting to smell rather earthy. Earthy is a good word for how they're smelling. So they just go straight into the pot, every last one in there. And the lid goes on. I will be plugging that in and turning it on in a moment. So into the other pot is going the petunias. And again, I've been harvesting petunias off of my plants in the front and backyards. So the fresh ones that you see are the ones that I pulled today. And the rest in this bag, again, were petunias that I've been pulling off and keeping in the freezer. Now, I've been pulling off fresh blooms, but I've also been pulling off, you know, when you deadhead your plants to keep them blooming and you pull off the ones that are, you know, a little bit not so nice looking anymore. I've been saving all of those because I've noticed that even when the really dry ones, when they fall onto my deck and it rains, they do stain the deck. So I know there's some color in there somewhere, and yeah, I'm going to try and grab that today. So into the pot goes all of my dead-headed flowers. Pop that all in there. And again, I am going to have to be careful. I only have 1 spoon, but I'll have a ladle as well. So the ladle will be for one pot and the spoon will be for the other because I don't want any transference of color between the two. So I'm just going to plop this down a little bit. There we go. And oh, all of the petunias were purple petunias. And I'm going to put the lid on that one. I'm going to plug these in. I'm sorry, I'm going to be right in the camera's way. I'm going to plug these in. It's going to get a little bit darker. All right, and I'm going to turn them both on to a low temperature. So put it like this and like this. Hopefully you can still see well. And let me see what's going on here. Low and good. All right. So now we begin the waiting game. These are going to simmer for at least 2 hours, and then they are going to sit and come back down to room temperature for probably another 2 hours. So right now it is officially 11:30. So I will see you around 2:30. Yeah, so I'll see you later on this afternoon, and we will see what's happening in the dye pots. Thank you so much. See you in a bit. Okay, so it is significantly later in the day. In fact, instead of it being 3 hours later, it is 4 hours later. I did let the dye soak. Or dye cook, sorry. Just turning off the timer so they don't beep on us. I did let the dye cook for an additional hour and then had to cool for an hour. So it is now about 3:30. And I left you last at about 11:30 this morning. So as of 3:30, the next tasks that need to be done is all of the draining and straining. So I hope you can see all right. Starting out with our yarn pot. So this is the pot that had the Mordanting yarn in it, and there it is. So the water is now definitely cool to the touch. Well, not cool to the touch, warm to the touch. It is room temperature. So I am going to reach in here and find my little plastic doodads, the zip ties. And as I said, this is what's going to make it much, much easier to manage this yarn. And then I'll find the second one and pull that as well. And straight up and out. And I will dump the water into the other sink. There we go. Now I can just dump this straight down the drain. As I said, nothing in there was detrimental to the environment. It is just alum, which is a food safe ingredient, so I'm not too worried about just dumping it in the drain. If you're ever using things like iron mordants or anything like that, or chemically dyeing, of course, disposing down the drain is definitely not the way to go. So I'm just going to squeeze out some of the excess water, but I'm going to keep it wet. I don't want to dry the yarn before it goes into the dye pots. So there we go. And I'm just going to store that back in its pot and move that pot to the side. And now on to the dye. So for the dye, I'm going to be draining or straining the dye into my dye cup. Oh, I hope you can see that, my dye cup. I'm going to be straining that into here. So I need my measuring bowl, I need my strainer. And again, all of these are dye specific. They are labeled as just being used for dye. And I'll just put that over top. I will start out with the Dandelion dye pot. I do have to say that if you're doing this, make sure it's a nice day, because this dandelion stuff stinks really, really, really badly. It is not a pleasant smell. So I've had every window in my house open and fans exhausting the fumes. I know it's not a dangerous fume, but it is rather pungent in its aroma. So I'm just going to dump that through the strainer and into the measuring cup. See, it's still a little bit warm. That will cool the rest of the way very quickly now. And get all of that out of there. And I am going to rinse as well to get rid of all of the sediment. I don't want any sediment in the pot once the yarn gets into it. So I will put that in the sink. Thank goodness for double sinks. And I'm going to let that drain. So right now, this is sort of a muddy yellow color. Once I strain all the goodness out of here, this is going to go straight into my compost. I do have a city that does a composting pickup service. So my compost goes directly under my sink. Let me just get rid of that. And then it goes out into the compost bin later on. Oof. And that will be going out quickly because it stinks. All right. So let me grab my little glass container and I will show you the color that dye is coming out so far. So that is the color that I've got so far. So it's sort of like a greeny, yellowy, browny. I'm very curious to see what this is going to do to the yarn. It definitely has a green tint to it though. I hope you can see that well. All right, so this drained stock can go right back into the slow cooker pot, and I am going to put that back in its slow cooker, and I will bring over the other dye pot. All right, here we go. All right, so this was the pansies. Again, I'm just going to rinse this out, get rid of all that other dye bits and pieces, and the strainer as well. All right, and going to go through pretty much the same process with this dye bath. So these were the petunias, and this one is quite interesting because all of the flower stock has definitely lost its color. So it is definitely looking like we have cooked out some color. All right, so draining that off. Oh, a couple extras in there. This one doesn't seem to have the sediment that the other one did, which is kind of nice. Squish that out. As you can see, hopefully the blossoms have definitely lost their color. Things are looking pretty non-colored at this point in the strainer. And again, I'm going to get rid of that. Just off camera. Okay, so let me show you the color that we have managed to pull out of the petunias. So that is a nice deep purple color. I will be very excited if we can get this color onto the wool and then find it to be color fast. So fingers are crossed. All right, and I'm going to pour that right back into its slow cooker ceramic pot. Now, when you are doing dyeing, make sure that you are using either stainless steel or ceramic type pots like this. If you use other pots that are not stainless steel, the metal of the pot can change the colors in the dye pot. Not that that's always a bad thing. Sometimes you'll use iron mordants or other metals, tins, coppers, to change the colors in the dye. But I wanted to start out with knowing first what they do without being modified by other ingredients. So making sure that you're not using copper pots or tin pots or steel pots are really, really important. It must be stainless steel or ceramic in order to not influence the color in your dye. All right, so I'm going to move this pot back with the others. I am going to reposition the camera, so I'll see you in 2 seconds. Okay, so here we are. I have the dandelion dye here, the petunia dye over here, and let's get the yarn in the dye pots, shall we? So I have the drained yarn here. And there we go with our first skein, and I will pop the first skein into the petunia dye bath. Oh, you know what? Let me double check and make sure that you can see. Oh, I'm sorry. I probably just made everybody really dizzy. My apologies. All right. So here we go. I have the drained yarn. It is still very wet, which is what I want it to be. And I'm going to start out in the petunia dye bath, and I am going to slowly lower the yarn. Oh my goodness, that color looks amazing. Into the dye bath. There we are. And I'm going to use my wooden spoon and pop that down there. And then we will take the other skein of yarn, and it too is still very, very wet. And I'm going to lower that down into the dandelion dye bath. And then I will use the ladle to squash that down. Alrighty. So the next step is to bring these dye baths back up to temperature one more time. So I'm going to bring them back up to about that 82 to 84 degrees. Then I am going to shut the slow cookers off, and they're going to sit, and they're going to sit, and they're going to sit. So this will be the last time I talk to you today. Tomorrow, I will reset up and I will show you what's happened. I do let the dye pots sit for overnight, up to 24 hours. So the longer, I find that the longer you let them sit in the dye, the stronger your color ends up. So I will give you a sneak little peek of what's happening already in the dye pot. So already we can see that we are picking up some color. Not a ton of color there, but I think this dandelion is going to be a very soft color. So back into its dye pot, make sure it is nice and submerged. And there is still, oh, I'm sorry, I knocked the camera. There is still a bit of sediment in this pot, so it's going to take extra rinsing of this skein. Once it comes out of the dye pot, it will take some extra rinsing to get rid of that sediment. Now, I hope you can see over here. I am going to pull this out and look at that already. Hallelujah, we have a purple color coming. I am so stoked. All right, so I am going to lower that again slowly and gently into the dye pot. Now, while these are simmering in the dye pot, I am going to stir them gently about once every 15 minutes or so, just to make sure that all of the yarn is being exposed to the color. We will most likely get a little bit of variant within the dye pot, so there may be some variegation within the skeins, but I am really, really excited to see what happens here. All right, so I will pick this up again tomorrow after the yarn has come to temperature, cooked for about an hour, and then I will let it cool back to room temperature and it will sit in its colors overnight. I will come back tomorrow and show you how much dye has been taken in by the yarn, so we can see how exhausted the yarn baths have become, how clear they are, and how much color's gone into the yarn. Alrighty, so that is day one of a 2-day yarn dyeing process. Okay, thank you so much, and I will see you tomorrow. All right, so the moment of truth. The yarn has been in the yarn bath or the dye baths now for about 20 hours through and through. So it is time to do some rinsing. So this is where the moment of truth happens. And we will start out with the very, very stinky dandelion bath. I can't express how much or how badly this smelled throughout the process. So I am going straight into my sink here, where I will be rinsing the yarn in straight on tap water. All right, so here is, you know what, let's do it this way. Here is the yarn as I pull it out of the dye bath, squeezing out some of the excess and getting water everywhere. This is not a non-messy process. There we go. So I'm just going to lay that down on the counter and get rid of the rest of this dye bath. Now, as I said, this is all botanical. There is nothing that I need to worry about for just dumping it down the drain. So off it goes. All right. Now into the other sink, I will be placing the yarn and I will be running some water. So this water is just about room temperature, a little bit colder than room temperature. And we just want to see how much color is going to bleed out of this yarn, if any at all. The dye bath itself was fairly exhausted of color, which is a good thing, because that means that the yarn absorbed most of the color. So I have to say that this does look like it has taken up a nice soft yellow hue. And as I said, that's from the Dandelion. So a nice soft yellow hue seems to have taken up. I am just going to rinse out this first, and it does not look as if there is any runoff, although the runoff would be very, very, very pale, and I'm not sure we'd see it at all. So I'm going to let that go, and then I will fill it up once more. And this time I am going to use a little bit of my wool wash. So this is Eculin. Of course, this video is sponsored by no one but me. This is the wool wash that I tend to like. There are dyers out there who just use Dawn dish detergent as well. What I like about the wool wash is that it will add back a little bit of the lanolins that are missing from the yarn. So it'll soften it up again, condition the yarn just a little bit. So I'm just going to let it sit there for a few moments. And then we will be back to see what happened with the purple dye. Okay, so back with our purple dye. I can already tell you that this did not absorb as much color as I had hoped. When I saw the color of the dye yesterday, I was super, super stoked, and it did not absorb as much of that purple color as I had hoped, but it still has given an interesting result. So, moment of truth, are you ready? All right, so there is the dye bath. The yarn is still in there. There is my plastic doohickey. So as you can see, the yarn coming out does have a purple tint to it. Now, I don't know what's going to happen when we rinse. We will have to find out. So again, I am going to just dump. So this dye bath is nowhere near as exhausted, as I hope you can see, as the other dye bath was. And again, no problem just rinsing this straight down the drain. And we'll see if any of this stayed or whether we are going to have to re-dye this yarn again. All right, so this one is definitely losing some color. Uh-oh, it's not looking good. We may not have a whole lot of color retention in this skein, which is kind of sad. But you know what? That is part of natural dyeing and part of experimenting with different dye materials, collecting different materials and experimenting and seeing what happens. Yeah, it's looking like all this purple is rinsing straight out of this yarn. Oh, that's kind of disappointing. But you know what? It wouldn't have known if we hadn't have tried. It does still have some color in it. It's actually looking a little green. All right, let's turn this off and rinse this out. Well, it doesn't look like we're having a whole lot of extreme color payoff on either of these skeins, which is disappointing. But as I said, it is part of the process. So let me pop this back in here and fill it back up one more time with a little bit of wool wash. And we'll swoosh that around, let it soak for a few minutes. You know what? It's not looking purple, but it is looking rather green, which, as I understand, is a fairly hard color to achieve. So maybe it wasn't such a disappointment as I anticipated. All right, so I'm just going to let that soak for a few minutes, then I will rinse it off and I will hang them to dry. So this was day 2. Tomorrow we will come back and I will show you the final results of our Dandelion and Petunia dye experiment and see where we're going to go from there. All right, we'll see you tomorrow. All right, everybody, welcome to day 3. So this is the 3rd day in a 3-day process to get some yarn dyed, and let me show you the final product. So starting out with the yarn that we dyed using the Dandelion. If you remember, we just took the dandelions, threw them in the pot, extracted dandelion, very stinky dandelion juice, and this is what we've come up with. So this dye I consider a success. It is a creamy yellow type color, nice and soft and subtle. I am quite pleased with how this one turned out. The biggest complaint I have about Dandelion is the smell, the stench, the stink. It was disgusting. If I do dandelions again, it's going to have to be something that happens outside, not in my house, because whoo-wee, it was stinky. All right, so the other skein, if you remember, I was really, really excited about the color of dye that seemed to be coming into the dye pot. However, when we rinsed the yarn, we saw that that was not necessarily translating into dye. And this is the color that we ended up with on the skein. So it too is a yellow tone, but definitely has some green undertoning to it. Let me put them side by side and you will see the difference in color. I am quite pleased with this one as well. It is not the purple that I was so excited about, but I have an idea for purple and it comes from black beans. But until then, I am quite pleased with this. There is color variance. Now, before you say, Nicole, those aren't dyed at all. Like this doesn't, it looks exactly the same. Let me show you the yarn as a bare yarn and you'll be able to hopefully see the difference. Again, this is the first time I have recorded a dye session and I am not entirely sure how well everything is turning out. So let's cross our fingers. But you know what? If it's not perfect, we will learn together. Oh my goodness, this skein is a mess. I dropped it on the floor. I do apologize. Oh my goodness. Apparently, I will be reskeining some yarn. Alrighty, well, here is a very messy bare skein of yarn. So in that, you can see the color difference between bare, Dandelion, and Petunia. So that's it. That is today's adventure in the dye pot. I want to thank you very much for coming along on this adventure with me. And if this is something that you enjoyed, please give it a thumbs up. If this is your first time with the channel, this has been a little bit different. I do normally just do a crochet type chat. But if this is something you're interested in, I do plan to be sharing more of my dye adventures. My next adventure coming up will be based on cherry. My sister has a sour cherry tree, which is filled with fruit. So I'm going to do one dye bath with fruit and one dye bath with leaves and stems, because they should give us 2 different colors. So that's pretty exciting. Yes, so stay tuned for that. Be watching for that. And be watching later on this week when I will be releasing a Rabe Creations episode, a normal episode, not a dyeing episode, where I will share with you my makes, my works in progress, and some major life news. Alrighty, thank you very much. Again, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do hit that subscribe button. To all of my new subscribers, hello, thank you. Yes, and I will see you all soon. I hope you join me again on my next adventure from the dye pot. Bye now.